My name is Farhat Navi, and this is the story of my life, marked by God's care in the most impossible moments. I remember a freezing night in the mountains of Gizar, when the wind felt like sharp blades cutting through the air, and the temperature was so low that each breath seemed to turn to ice. I carried my 8-month-old son against my chest, while my wife, Serena, carefully followed my footprints in the snow. Footprints that, strangely, disappeared behind us, as if an invisible hand were erasing our path. What I share today is a living testimony of God's protective care. He guided us through an almost impossible journey across the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, when all we had were 3 stale loaves of bread hidden in our clothes and a toy compass bought at a bazaar. It all began on a gray October morning in 2021, in our small apartment in the Sino neighborhood of Duhanbe. The sound of violent knocking on the door woke our son, Amir, startling him. Before I could react, the door gave way. 4 men in plain clothes stormed our house with cold precision, as if they had been repeating this ritual for years. "National Security Committee," announced the man at the front, while the others searched every corner. In Tajikistan, where 98% of the population is Muslim, being Christian is not just a personal choice. It is seen as a betrayal of national identity and a threat to the stability of the state. Since independence in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the government has closed the vast majority of registered churches. Owning a Bible in Cyrillic or Catholic script could result in 5 years in prison, where torture was common practice. Those men, agents of the KNB, the country's secret police, followed methods inherited from the old KGB. With precise, cold hands, they destroyed every corner of our homes. "We know what you do on Wednesday nights," one of them said, throwing a photograph onto the table that sent shivers down my spine. It was Amir, our little one, being baptized in the apartment's bathtub, an intimate ritual we had performed with only 3 friends, or at least we thought it was secret. "Do you want to tell us the names now, or would you prefer to spend a night in our institution?" he said, smiling, while the threat hung silently in the air. I was never a hunted man. I grew up in Douai, the son of a respected mathematics professor, Rustam Navilivios. My father, a discreet man, survived the Soviet era by avoiding political and religious conflicts. My mother, Gulnora, wove traditional carpets to supplement my father's modest salary. Our apartment, small but always full of books, reflected my father's belief that education could change destinies. He always said, "In this life, there are only 2 things that no one can take away from you: your knowledge and your integrity." At that time, I still had no idea how prophetic my father's words would be. The first time I heard something truly meaningful about Christianity was during my civil engineering studies at university. A colleague, Timur, lent me a book that would change my life, a worn copy of the New Testament in Russian. What began as intellectual curiosity quickly transformed into a spiritual quest that challenged everything I had learned about the world. "What you will find in these pages," Timur whispered to me as we walked across campus, "may cost you everything you own, but it will also give you something that no one can ever take away." His words echoed my father's teachings about knowledge and integrity, creating an invisible bridge between the education I had received and the path that was beginning to unfold before me. Our conversations began innocently, philosophizing in noisy cafes where no one paid attention. Over time, these discussions moved to more private places, first in Timur's small apartment, then in houses that alternated weekly. There, in whispers, we read forbidden passages and reflected on a God of love, so different from the rigid official religion that shaped our society. It was at one of these meetings that I met Serena, tall, with dark eyes that seemed to hold the depth of the Pamir Mountains. She worked as a nurse at the Central Hospital in Dushanbe. Her quiet faith and courage captivated me from the first moment. Unlike me, she possessed a tranquil firmness that inspired me to keep going. My own faith had ancient and secret roots. My grandmother had been baptized by a Korean missionary during the Soviet era, who risked his life to bring the gospel to Central Asia. She was the one who taught me to pray under the covers, whispering words that, she said, reached heaven with greater force. I remember walking with her through Rudaki Park, pretending only to appreciate the sunset, while she showed me the power of silent prayers. Our wedding in 2019 followed the civil tradition, simple and discreet. 3 days later, however, in the basement of a faithful friend's house, we exchanged vows before God and a small group of brothers and sisters in faith. I remember the candles trembling with each gust of wind that entered through the windows near the ceiling, as if even the light knew it needed to remain discreet. When Serena became pregnant in early 2020, our joy was mixed with constant fear. Bringing a child into this world meant exposing him to unseen but unavoidable dangers. "How will we protect his faith?" Serena asked, caressing her belly. "How will we teach him to live a truth that must remain hidden?" We had no clear answers, only the conviction that the same God who had guided our steps would find a way for our son. Our little Amir was born in May 2021, with his mother's dark eyes and, as everyone said, my stubbornness. His arrival coincided with a period of increasing pressure on believers throughout Tajikistan, a time when our faith would be tested in ways we couldn't yet imagine. President Emomali Rahmon, in power since 1994, had drastically tightened laws against what the government called religious extremism, a broad term used to persecute any group that did not align with the official version of Sunni Islam. At that time, our apartment was one of the few safe places for Christians in Duhanbe. The windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking not only the light but also curious glances. We learned to sing hymns softly, to measure each word, and to constantly check for any listening devices. Paranoia wasn't irrationality, it was a matter of survival. "Always put a chair under the doorknob when we go to pray," advised Dablad, a man who had survived decades of persecution since Soviet times, and never leave the house unprepared. At the end of each meeting, we would disperse in pairs, with intervals of at least 10 minutes. Every Wednesday evening, 5 to 7 people would gather in our living room. Memorizing passages from the Bible became essential, because we knew that, on the day our few copies were confiscated, the word would have to live only in our hearts. Serena created an ingenious system. She transcribed verses onto small pieces of paper that could be quickly swallowed if the police showed up. Amir's baptism was my idea. I felt an inexplicable urgency, as if an inner voice was warning me that time was running out. "We need to do this now," Serena insisted one September night, rocking our son to sleep. "We can't wait." The ceremony took place in our own bathtub, with almost cold water, so as not to disturb Amir. Sarkis, a religious leader who had secretly studied theology under the tutelage of Armenian missionaries, officiated the baptism with discreet words and gestures. It was just us, Sarkis, and 2 close friends as witnesses, Timur and his wife, Medina. We didn't know at the time that Timur, my university friend who had given me my first New Testament, had been broken. 3 months of interrogations, threats against his family, and the loss of his job had undermined his resistance. The KNB had turned him into an informant, and the photograph the officer was now showing me was the silent proof of that betrayal. The realization of the betrayal would only come later. At that moment, facing the agents who were ransacking our house, all I knew was that someone had betrayed us and that our lives were about to change forever. The National Security Committee's detention center in Duhanbe is a gray building with no visible identification, located on a quiet street near the city's administrative center. To passers-by, it looks like just another government building. But those who know its true purpose understand that all the constitutional guarantees of religious freedom that Tajikistan proclaims to the international community disappear there. I was taken directly from our apartment, handcuffed in the back seat of a black sedan with no license plates. Sarina was allowed to stay with Amir, but under the watch of 2 policewomen. "Your wife and son will be fine, as long as you cooperate," said the officer leading the operation, while a feeling of helplessness washed over me. A middle-aged man named Asis spoke calmly, as if absolutely certain of his power. The cell was small, about 3 by 4 meters, and furnished only with a rusty metal bunk bed, a toilet without a lid visible from anywhere in the room, and a bare lamp that never went out. The walls, painted a faded green typical of institutions, were marked with inscriptions from previous occupants. Desperate prayers, counts of days, names that perhaps no one on the outside remembered anymore. The first interrogation began 3 hours later. I was sitting in a metal chair in the center of a stark room, surrounded by 3 men: Asis, a younger man who was taking notes, and another whose face remained partially hidden in the shadows. "We are here to help you," began Farhad Rustamovich, using my formal patronymic. "Your situation is serious, but not hopeless. We know you have been deceived by foreign influences seeking to destabilize our homeland. Give us the names of those who organize these illegal meetings, and you can return to your family tonight." I remained silent, remembering Sarkis's words. Each name given would represent a real person, with a real family, whose life would be destroyed. The silence seemed to irritate Asis. "Do you know what happens to children whose parents are imprisoned for religious extremism?" he asked, changing his tone. "The state places them in special institutions, where they are re-educated. By the age of 8, many don't even remember their parents' names anymore." The man in the shadows spoke for the first time. Perhaps he doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. Showing him the files might clear his mind. The young man with the notes placed a folder in front of me. As I opened it, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Photographs of each of us, from the meetings of the last 3 months, were inside. Images of Serena and me entering the homes of other believers. Photos of Sarkis visiting our apartment. And, most disturbingly, Amir sleeping in his crib, clearly taken from inside our own home. "We have eyes and ears everywhere," Asis explained in an almost bored tone. "The question isn't whether your group will fall, but how many will fall with you." The interrogations continued for 3 days, alternating between feigned gestures of friendship and outright intimidation. On one occasion, they let me hear Amir crying over a loudspeaker, a cruel reminder of what was at stake. There was no need for physical violence. The fear for my family was torture enough. On the 3rd day, Asis entered the cell with an official document. "It's simple," he said, placing it in front of me along with a pen. "Sign this declaration renouncing your religious activities and provide the names of the organizers. This way you can return to your family under supervision." My eyes scanned the paper. It described my supposed renunciation of faith, claiming I had been deceived by foreign agents seeking to undermine Tajikistan's national unity. The choice seemed clear, but my heart knew that yielding would mean more than my freedom. It would be the death of our faith and of Amir's hope. At the end of the document, there were blank spaces to list names. "What if I refuse?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. The officer looked at me coldly. "Sign this renunciation of your faith or you will lose custody of Amir." It wasn't a vague threat. He showed me the state custody document already prepared, awaiting only the judge's signature. I was released on the 5th day, not out of compassion, but as part of a calculated strategy. "We want you to see your wife and son," Asis said as he returned my belongings. "We want you to remember what's at stake. You have a week to reconsider your position." I returned to an apartment that no longer felt like home. During my absence, they had installed visible surveillance devices, as if they wanted us to feel the oppression in every gesture. A black van remained parked in front of the building, with men who didn't even try to hide when we entered or left. Serena greeted me with eyes red from crying. Amir, normally cheerful, seemed tense, crying frequently. During my detention, female police officers had interrogated her daily, alternating tactics, all equally devastating. They showed me pictures of children in state-run orphanages. Serena confided in me that night, when we finally managed to speak with relative privacy in the kitchen, leaving the tap running to muffle our voices. They said I had to choose between God and my son. The pressure wasn't just coming from the state. The day after my release, Serena's parents showed up at our door. Her father, always reserved, was consumed by fury. "How could you bring this disgrace to our family?" he asked, while her mother wept silently behind him. "Everyone in the neighborhood knows the religious police took you. My boss warned me I could lose my job. 30 years of service, thrown away." Serena's mother took Amir in her arms, in tears. "If you continue, you'll lose this son," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Even my own parents reacted the same way. My father, always eloquent, could barely look me in the eye. "I raised you to think for yourself," he finally said, "but not to throw your life off a cliff. If you need spirituality, there are acceptable ways to experience it without putting the whole family in danger." The following days were a whirlwind. Visits from concerned relatives, suddenly distant neighbors, and even twice representatives from the local mosque, offering advice to guide us back to the path the state considered safe. As the end of the week designated by ACES approached, the pressure became almost unbearable. Our phones were tapped, internet access mysteriously cut off, and friends began to avoid us, fearing any contact. One night, while Amir slept, Serena held my hands in hers. Her eyes, though tired, shone with a determination I had never seen before. At that moment I realized that our faith, even surrounded by fear, was more alive than ever. "We can't go on like this," Serena said softly. "We can't give up on our faith," I added, though I knew it wasn't enough. "But we also can't let them take our son." "So, what do you suggest?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer in my heart. "We have to leave," she said simply. "Not just this apartment or this city. We needed to leave Tajikistan." That night, while Dushanbe slept, we began to plan what seemed impossible, escaping the most heavily guarded country in Central Asia with an 8-month-old baby and no valid passports. In the dead of winter, planning an escape required more than determination. It demanded meticulous strategy, developed in full view of everyone watching us. Every purchase had to seem routine, every conversation banal, every preparation disguised as an everyday activity. We couldn't trust anyone openly. Timu's betrayal had taught us that even the closest friends could succumb to pressure. Still, we needed help. It was Serena who suggested contacting her uncle Jamal, a former border guard who now lived as a shepherd in a remote village in the Gizar Mountains, near the border with Kyrgyzstan. But how could they reach him without alerting those monitoring their calls? The answer came unexpectedly. "My patient in room 317, Serena whispered as she prepared dinner, pretending to comment on her day at the hospital. "He works as a street vendor in the border markets. I asked him to deliver a message to my uncle on his next trip." The message was simple, but coded. Gulnora's daughter needed to collect medicinal herbs before the first snows arrived. To the untrained eye, it sounded like traditional medicine. To Jamal, it meant we needed to cross the border before the mountain passes became impassable. For the next 10 days, we made meticulous preparations under the pretense of normalcy. I bought a toy compass at the children's fair, saying it was a gift for a colleague's son. Serena managed to get some thick fabric, supposedly for new curtains, but she actually used it to sew hidden pockets into our winter coats. In them, she wrote psalms on small pieces of fabric, each stitch a prayer. She explained that if one of us were captured, the other would still carry part of the word. The biggest challenge was Amir. How to keep him warm in the mountains, where the cold could be deadly. How to get him to sleep without crying, when every noise could mean capture. With the methodical precision of her nursing training, Serena devised a plan. She began to accustom Amir to sleeping in a thermal baby carrier with multiple layers of fabric, constantly whispering so that he would associate that space with sleep. For days, she practiced inside the apartment, each movement and each whisper preparing him for the journey that would change our lives. We hid in a small, makeshift shelter, surrounded by silence and a faint sense of security. To feed ourselves, we carried only what was absolutely necessary: 3 dry, heavy, and nutritious loaves of bread, carefully hidden in our clothes, and bottles of frozen breast milk, our only source of liquids. We trusted that the mountain cold would keep them safe to drink for a few days, a risk we accepted without hesitation. A week later, Yamal's reply arrived, relayed by the same street vendor who had helped us before. "The best time is when the moon sets," the coded message read. Translated, it meant he would be waiting for us at a specific point on the border during the new moon, when everything would be completely dark. On the night before our departure, kneeling beside Amir's crib, I held Serena's hands. "We don't know if we'll make it," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "But I'd rather fight for a future of freedom for him than live knowing we're condemning him to grow up without choices." She nodded, letting silent tears fall onto our son's blanket. We spent that night awake, praying, mentally rehearsing every step of the plan, and trusting completely in that God who, somehow, had guided us to this point. We set off before dawn, while the city still slept under the fresh snow that covered the streets. Our plan to evade surveillance was simple, but desperate. Serena would leave first with Amir, supposedly on her way to the hospital, and I would follow later, under the pretext of a meeting at the university. Neither of us, however, would arrive where we were supposed to. Serena took a taxi to the East Bus Terminal and boarded a minibus bound for Barsop, in the mountains an hour from the capital. I took a different route, leaving from the West Bus Terminal, detouring as much as possible to throw off any pursuers. Our meeting point was a narrow, recently restored road, where Yamal's nephew, Firas, would be waiting to guide us on the first leg of the journey. The mountain cold hit us hard, 12 degrees, biting and merciless. We left behind the last checkpoint and any semblance of normality. Firas led us along almost invisible trails, used only by smugglers and local shepherds. Miraculously, Amir slept soundly in my arms, protected by layers of clothing and the warmth emanating from both of us. From here to the Karamik Pass, we'll have 5 nights of walking, Firas explained, handing us rudimentary maps drawn by Yamal. He explained that Yamal would be waiting for us on the other side in Kyrgyz territory, but if we didn't arrive in 7 days, he would assume we hadn't made it. The first night revealed how little we knew about the cold. Nothing we had experienced before could have prepared us for it. It was brutal, relentless, and unforgettable. At 3,000 meters altitude, the air was biting, each breath a painful reminder of how fragile we were. We found shelter in a small cave that Firuz knew, too cramped for the 3 of us, where a timid fire gave us warmth for only a few minutes, just enough time not to attract attention with the smoke. For 5 nights, we walked along frozen riverbeds, avoiding any military checkpoints. Each step was an act of faith, each sigh a silent prayer, and in Bishkek, I would later tell humanitarian workers about this journey that seemed to defy life itself. On the second day, the cold intensified. The wind howled so fiercely that we sometimes had to crawl to avoid being blown away. Amir began to suffer from the cold. His muffled cries pierced our hearts. Serena, exhausted but steadfast, breastfed him as we walked, balancing the baby and holding our lives in her hands. Progress was painfully slow. What for an experienced hiker would be a whole day, for us seemed to double in length. Carrying a baby, we stopped at every step to warm ourselves, sleep for short periods among the rocks, and advance mainly at night, when patrols were less frequent. On the 3rd night, we felt for the first time that we could lose everything. As we rounded a narrow path on a mountainside, we heard voices and flashlights approaching. A border patrol was approaching. We pressed against the rocks, holding our breath, with no room to hide. Amir, perhaps sensing our tension, began to stir. His crying, held back until then, threatened to erupt. "Shh, calm down, little one," Serena whispered desperately, but he was still restless. Then something incredible happened. A sudden gust of wind swept down from the valley, so strong that the guards stopped, covering their faces and shouting at each other. The wind lasted long enough for them to decide to return to the shelter, letting us escape that patrol. On the 4th night, a snowstorm formed above us. We advanced almost blindly, guided only by the toy compass and the details of the map Yamal had given us. During this journey, we discovered signs that we were not the first to travel this path. Small caves sheltered the remains of campfires, still warm ashes, food scraps, and in one case a forgotten hat, traces left by others who, like us, had chosen to risk everything for freedom. Among these signs, we found something that touched us deeply. One of the caves clearly showed that someone had left recent traces of passage, silent reminders of families and travelers who had trusted in the same faith that sustained us. We felt, at that moment, that we were not alone, that the hand of God guided every step, even in the cruel silence of the mountains. Someone had simply carved a cross into the stone wall, accompanied by the words in Russian, "He goes ahead of you." That anonymous message, left by an unknown traveler, was like fresh water in a desert for our weary souls. On the 5th night, it gave us strength to continue, reminding us that we were not alone, and that someone before us had trusted in the same faith that sustained us. As we approached the border of Kamik, at an altitude of 4,300 meters, we experienced something I can only call supernatural. The snow had stopped, but the cold reached extreme levels, dropping to 30 degrees C. As we slowly advanced across the white field, we noticed something inexplicable. Our footprints, which we had just left, mysteriously disappeared minutes later. I exchanged a glance with Serena, both of us reflecting astonishment and fear. It was just the wind, perhaps, covering our tracks with loose snow, or perhaps it was more than that, something we couldn't comprehend with human logic. In any case, that gave us a crucial advantage. The patrols couldn't track us, Each step propelled us with renewed hope, not only toward the physical border, but also out of a life of oppression and into the promise of freedom. The dawn of the 6th day found us at the foot of the Kamik Pass, a narrow rocky gorge that marks the natural border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. At 4,300 meters, the air was thin, each breath requiring conscious effort. The landscape, wild and unbelievably beautiful, seemed otherworldly. Untouched snow stretched across vast areas, interrupted only by sharp black rocks that jutted out like the teeth of a prehistoric beast. We were exhausted beyond description. There was only a stale piece of bread left. Amir's bottles of frozen breast milk had run out that morning. My feet, trapped in boots ill-suited for the extreme cold, had been completely numb for hours. Sarina walked, moved only by the strength of her faith, murmuring prayers, her lips cracked and her breathing heavy. It was at this point that tragedy almost overtook us. Halfway up the climb, my legs gave way. I fell to my knees in the snow, unable to get up. The cold, exhaustion, and altitude took their toll. My body trembled uncontrollably. Hypothermia was rapidly setting in. "Here, Amir," I murmured to Sarina, struggling to articulate words with my icy lips. "Jamal is waiting for us on the other side." She knelt beside me, her eyes reflecting a fierce determination, even in the face of her frail body. "No one gets left behind," she declared, almost unconsciously repeating the words Sarkis used to tell us in our clandestine meetings. Resting at that moment was as dangerous as continuing, but our bodies no longer responded. Sarina held me, murmuring prayers, while I felt consciousness begin to fade. The cold intensified, and hypothermia threatened to engulf everything. But together, with faith and courage, we still managed to remember that each step brought us closer to freedom. I was talking to him about Amir, about our future, about anything that could keep him conscious. I felt each passing minute as a step closer to losing him. It was at that moment that something I can't explain happened. As the sun began to set and the cold intensified, a faint blue light emerged between the cliffs, slowly beginning to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. It didn't come from any flashlight, campfire, or any natural phenomenon we knew of. At first I thought my oxygen-deprived brain was playing tricks on me, but Sarina saw it too. Even Amir, usually restless, fell silent, fascinated by that supernatural luminescence. "We have to follow it," Sarina murmured, helping me to my feet. In my heart, I felt God showing us the way, with strength I didn't know I possessed. I stood up, and we began to move forward, step by step, guided by that mysterious light. The light guided us along the safest path, avoiding hidden crevices and unstable ledges that, in our exhaustion, could have been fatal. When we finally reached the top of the passage, the light shone more intensely for a moment, illuminating a natural shelter between two rocks, a space protected from the wind where we managed to rest for a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light disappeared. We had barely caught our breath when we heard something that chilled our blood, the distant barking of dogs. Border patrols often used trained dogs to sniff out travelers in the snow. We were exhausted, exposed, and vulnerable. It seemed our miracle had come to an end. But then, the second miracle of that extraordinary night happened. From the shadows emerged a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in traditional Kyrgyz clothing, silently signaling for us to follow him. He quickly guided us down a path we would never have found on our own. To our surprise, it wasn't Yamal, as we had expected, but a local shepherd named Kubat, who didn't normally venture so high into the mountains during winter. Skillfully, he led us through a labyrinth of rock formations to a small, semi-ruined shepherd's hut, which, surprisingly, was warmed by a small fire fueled with dried dung. Inside the shelter, Amir eagerly drank the warm goat's milk that Kubat offered us. Only then did I understand the purpose of that impossible encounter. Kubat told us, as if it were a divine mission, that he had seen that same blue light on rare occasions in the last 20 years, always guiding people in danger. A family of shepherds trapped by an avalanche, an injured climber, and now us. That light was not just a light. It was a sign of hope, a reminder that God never abandons us, even when all seems lost. "I don't know exactly what it is," Kubat confessed simply. "But my grandfather used to say that the mountains have angels who protect travelers with pure hearts." We spent that night in his cabin, recovering our bodies and minds after the grueling journey. At dawn, he led us to a spot where Jamal was waiting for us, exactly as promised. The border had been crossed. We were officially in Kyrgyzstan. We weren't entirely safe, but each step brought us closer to freedom. Bishkek, the Kyrgyz capital, with its wide, shaded avenues and buildings that blend Soviet and contemporary Asian styles, seemed to represent what we so desperately wanted. We could walk the streets without the constant fear of being arrested. No one knew us. But we soon discovered that, for Christian refugees like us, freedom came at a high price. We lived in a particularly precarious legal and social limbo. Jamal connected us with a small community of Talik believers in Bishkek, about 15 families living on the fringes of society. Initially, we stayed in a small apartment shared with another family in the Sverdlovsky neighborhood. One room for each family, shared bathroom and kitchen. After what we had been through in the mountains, that space seemed like a palace. But reality soon showed us that our journey was far from over. The situation was desperate. Without legal documents, our options were minimal. We couldn't work officially, open bank accounts, or access regular medical care. Serena, a qualified nurse, limited herself to providing basic care to other undocumented immigrants, receiving small amounts of money or food. I found work in construction, where they didn't ask questions, as long as we agreed to receive half the salary of a local worker. It was exhausting and dangerous, but every coin we earned brought us closer to our greater goal: to gather enough resources to seek asylum in a country that truly respected our rights. The asylum system in Kyrgyzstan, though it existed on paper, rarely functioned for people in our situation. Without visible physical scars of torture, without official documentation of persecution, our oral account was not enough. In April 2022, we submitted our first application. We had barely begun to explain our story when the official abruptly interrupted. "We don't have the resources to process cases like yours. Kyrgyzstan is not Europe. We are looking for real refugees, not people who just want a better life." We returned in July, better prepared. A volunteer lawyer from a small Christian NGO helped us prepare a detailed application, with sworn statements from other refugees who had lived through similar experiences in Tajikistan. For the first time, our application was accepted, only to be rejected 3 weeks later due to inconsistencies in our account and a lack of supporting documentation. The feeling of frustration was profound, but we couldn't give up. Each closed door was also a reminder that we were alive, and that our faith and determination needed to be greater than any bureaucratic obstacle. Even from afar, the shadow of Tajikistan never left us. 2 months after our arrival in Bishkek, Serena received a phone call that chilled her blood. It was her cousin, speaking with a cold, calculated formality. "Your father wants you to know that the family will not rest until the shame he brought is corrected." Each word carried the threat we knew lay behind the speech. The warning was clear. Our lives were still within the reach of the Taliban authorities. The intimidation of relatives pressured by the government would, from then on, become a constant presence in our lives. The threat was not empty. We knew of cases of refugees who had been kidnapped in Kyrgyzstan and taken back to Tajikistan. The emotional dimension of this affected Amir silently, but intensely. Although so small, he absorbed the tension like a sponge. He developed a fear of strangers, especially men in dark uniforms. His nightmares became frequent and distressing, and each nightly cry reminded us that, even in relative safety, the child still carried the weight of the trauma. Our son, at 14 months old, should have been discovering the world with joy and curiosity, but instead, he trembled at the slightest noise and clung to us desperately. Even our religious practices, which had once sustained us with strength and hope, had to remain discreet, almost secret. When Serena prayed aloud, she muffled the sounds with pillows, whispering prayers that no one else could hear. Even far from Tajikistan, we weren't entirely free. Hostility against converted Christians was real, and although it wasn't official, it was felt in the streets, in suspicious glances, in the silent daily life. Our underground church in Bishkek became a true refuge. There we shared not only our faith, but also the few resources we had. It was through this network that the first hopes for a safer future emerged, an international Christian organization that helped religious refugees resettle in other countries. The road was long, full of uncertainties, but it was the first clear light in years of darkness. While we awaited news, We continued to live cautiously, each knock on the door, each ringing phone reminding us that freedom was still fragile. Every car parked too long in front of our building reminded us of that morning in Duxby, of the Yizar Mountains, and of the moment our entire lives changed. 3 years have passed since that impossible walk, and now, writing from these pages in the relative safety of a country that protects us, I can't help but think of those who stayed behind. In the damp basements and apartments with drawn curtains in Tajikistan, the faithful continue to gather, silent but firm in their faith, resisting for that which is greater than the fear they try to impose. What few people know about Tajikistan is painfully silent. Since the country gained independence in 1991, almost all registered churches, 98% of them, have been closed. The so-called law against religious extremism has become a weapon to silence any expression of faith that escapes the government's rigid control. Possessing a Bible in Tajik Cyrillic can mean up to 5 years in prison. Children are taught from a young age to denounce any religious practice outside of what the state approves. And yet, faith survives. Like the ancient Roman catacombs, the underground church in Tajikistan keeps its flame burning, silent, but persistent. Families memorize entire passages of scripture because possessing the book is a mortal risk. Mothers teach their children to pray without opening their mouths, almost in secret. Fathers risk everything so that their children may know the true God. This flame of courage and faith is what inspires us to continue. Amir, now almost 4 years old, has finally begun to speak normally, although he still looks suspiciously at strangers. Serena has managed to partially resume her work as a nurse, helping other refugee families, while I study the local language and translate materials for newcomers from Central Asia. The scars of what we lived through will never completely disappear. On cold nights, I wake up sweating, believing for a few seconds that we are still in the glacial mountains. Serena is still startled by loud knocks on the door, and we both instinctively look over our shoulders when talking about our faith, even though we now live in a country where it is not forbidden. But there is one verse that came alive for us, which Serena sewed onto our coats during our escape. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, I will not let them sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not consume you. Isaiah 43:2. In those moments, the waters were the frozen rivers of the Yizar Mountains, and the fire was the pursuit that nearly destroyed us. But in the midst of it all, we felt the real and tangible presence of a God who not only observes, but walks with us through the darkest valleys. If there is one thing I want to share with those who live in religious freedom, it is this. The persecution of Christians in places like Tajikistan is not history or sensationalism. It is real. Every church closed, every believer imprisoned, every Bible confiscated represents real lives, real families, stories of quiet courage. To the brothers and sisters who worship in secret, I say, you are not alone. Your witness echoes far beyond the country's borders, reaching hearts that may never know the fear you face. Mountains, deserts, frozen rivers. God was with us through them all. Their silent prayers don't just reach God's ears. They reach a worldwide family of believers who, though imperfect and distant, have not forgotten them. For those who wonder if it's worth risking everything for their faith, I share our story not as an example of heroism, but as a testament to the fact that there are convictions more important than comfort, security, or even life itself. Convictions for which it's worth crossing icy mountains, facing family rejection, and living as strangers in unknown lands. Our footprints in the snow have faded, but the hand that guided us has left eternal marks on our hearts. This is what I say when asked to summarize our experience. The path of faith is rarely easy and never predictable. But we did not walk alone. As Amir grows, we will tell him about the mountains he crossed as a baby, about the blue light that guided us when all seemed lost, and about the God who opens paths where none seem to exist. Perhaps one day, when Tajikistan finally knows freedom, we can walk the streets of Dushanbe again without fear, openly sharing the story of how God's love proved stronger than the hatred of men. Until then, we will continue to pray for the persecuted church, remembering that our own challenges are only a small part of a worldwide witness of faith that transcends borders, regimes, and persecutions. As we used to say in an old hymn we whispered in our secret meetings, though darkness may seem to prevail, His light will never be extinguished. No snow is too deep, no night too dark, to erase God's footprints in our lives.